But we're really excited to talk to Al Sabin today, another one of our artists from the 5 Contemporary Iowa Landscape Artists exhibition. And just to give a brief preview before Al speaks for himself, Al Sabin is a lifelong resident of Cedar Rapids who studied drawing and painting at Kirkwood College, where he was the recipient of the Outstanding Achievement Award in Painting in '78. He studied design advertising at Iowa State University and worked as an illustrator for the Iowa State Daily newspaper. Spent his working career in the advertising and printing industry in Cedar Rapids. Al studied watercolor technique with Joe Messner, has participated in the 2x2 by You public art exhibit, EcoFest International Sculpture Exhibition, the 2018 Des Moines Heritage Museum exhibition, and of course the Nubo Arts Festival. And his work is collected by many public and private institutions. So we are thrilled to have Al with us today. And Al, I will just start off by asking you a little bit about how you came to art and maybe watercolor specifically.
Well, I'll start off by saying that my parents always made sure that I had plenty of paper and drawing materials as a kid. So my father worked in a box factory and brought home huge sheets of cardboard that I drew on. Our next door neighbors brought paper from, I think it was Kilborn Photo, stacks of paper. And I started off as a doodler. And so I doodled and drew all the time. Didn't really paint, just drew. And when I got to school, I was the kid who the other kids were standing over their shoulder and watching me draw. So it was a good way to make friends and entertaining. And I really didn't take any art classes until I got to college. So my art basically was for entertainment for myself and my family until I got driven by some people that I met to maybe pursue it a little bit more seriously, I'll say. In all, I've just been fortunate in my life to have met a lot of influential and very fine artists that have steered me along and given me encouragement when I needed it. And that's how I've ended up where I am today. Where that is anybody's guess, but that's why I've ended up painting watercolors, because I've tried all the other mediums, and watercolor tends to challenge me in a way that some of the other mediums did or didn't at various times. And partially it's because of a spatial consideration I've had with studio space in my life, and watercolors can use significantly less space than a lot of other mediums. So does that answer your question, Kate?
Yeah, that's wonderful.
There's a lot of stuff in between the lines, but
what specifically drew you to landscape, and when did you start working in that genre?
Well, I think a lot of times we paint what we see. Mm-hmm. And I spent a considerable amount of time as a boy going to my grandparents' farm. And I spent a lot of time outside, and the trip there was basically in Iowa farmland and basically nothing but landscapes. Mm. So as a boy, I sat outside, played, ran, did everything boys do on a farm. But I started considering the shapes even then of what I saw in the gentle rolling hills of Northeast Iowa. And later on, I began painting images of their farm. And from there, I took off and kind of created my own voice, I hope, in the shapes of what I see in landscapes. Mm.
That's beautiful. Do you have a favorite type of scene to paint, or ones that you find particularly challenging?
Well, I find watercolor challenging, period. I think you called it temperamental, Kate. I think yes, that was.
I'm sure I used a lot of words for watercolor.
It's temperamental. Fortunately, backing up again, I've had some opportunity to see work of local artists, many of whom are friends of mine, and how they've approached and looked at landscapes for the shapes and the colors, and not necessarily trying to paint in a photographic sense, but basically in an impressionistic sense. And so my favorite kind of landscape basically is always going to have horizontal line, we'll call it a horizontal sight line of the focal point, and hopefully the shapes themselves illustrate my impression of the way the hills roll and the land lays of just a conventional Iowa landscape.
And let me bring up, where did I put it? Here we go. Let's start there, and there we go. Wait for that to go away. So yeah, I just wanted to look at some of your beautiful pieces, Al. And obviously I was very drawn to your landscapes, and I thought they made an amazing addition to our exhibition, both because you work in watercolor, and your work is so different from the other 4 artists in the exhibition. But yeah, as you said, I have called watercolor many things. It is very unforgiving and temperamental. So I was just really blown away by how you created these and how you were able to control the watercolor, because obviously it can get out of hand and go everywhere, but also there's so much freedom in these that I really enjoyed. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this one.
Well, back to the freedom point. I spent a lot of time drawing and painting in almost a draftsman type sense. A lot of my original paintings, I was trying to almost draw and paint in a realistic sense. And it took me a long time to free up my creativity. And with the watercolor, it kind of induced that. A lot of times you don't have any choice. As you said, the water goes where it wants to go and does what it wants to do a lot of times. Many times when I painted on paper, I would discover events, I'll call them, by how wet the paper was and how dry the paper was, and color on color. So when I decided to do this series on canvas, I kind of explored what I kind of knew what would happen on paper, and learned some things about the way watercolor can work on canvas. And I learned that you can really do a lot more layering in a canvas scenario than you can on conventional paper. The canvas will take much more of a beating, so to speak, with layer upon layer and scrubbing, that paper won't. So I had a lot of fun with the layering on these pieces, and did many preliminary sketches in a book until I decided on where I wanted horizon lines and colors specifically, and shapes. So the sky itself looks rather simple, and I'm alarmed at my photo, I guess, a little bit, because you can almost see the stretchers through it because I beat the canvas up so bad. But the canvas in the sky area alone, I think I scrubbed and rubbed it 5 or 6 times to get that effect.
Oh, wow.
With the paint. The foreground basically was painted with 3 or 4 washes of yellow and then scrubbed out light to dark. And in watercolor, because it isn't unforgiving to some extent, you almost have to think in reverse. When you paint things in oil and acrylics, you can go from light to dark or dark to light in a somewhat predictable way. But with watercolor, you've almost got to think in reverse and think about, how far can I scrub this down and still not have color left? Or how far can I scrub this down and still add color to it? So I put a lot of thought into the colors themselves in this, and the canvas, it took a beating. I will say that.
That's fascinating. I will tell you, our education director was fascinated when she discovered that you had painted these on canvases. Of course, she does a lot of watercolor activities with small children, because it's, as you know, portable and easier to explain. So she was really, really interested. And I think she'll get a lot out of this video hearing you talk about being able to scrub it down, because that is, as you say, something you usually can't do with watercolor on paper.
Right.
But you can really see it. I see it especially in the land, just that really intense layering. It's so wonderful.
It was a lot of fun. It really was.
I bet it was.
It was a lot of fun. It's like learning something all over again, going to canvas.
Oh, it's such a beautiful technique.
Could you describe what the technique of scrubbing is? I envision an old dry wash rag on the canvas. that's probably not right.
Well, you are not far off, Robert, sometimes, depending on the size of the area you're scrubbing. You can scrub it down. I have scrubbed it down with a sponge. I've scrubbed it down with a piece of rope, believe it or not, just the end of a piece of rope, and very wide brushes that you just keep applying water and wiping off with a rag. And you literally do scrub the canvas. So you're not far off. You're not far off. Smaller areas, maybe as small as a Q-tip doing some scrubbing. But you are literally, scrubbing is the word. You're scrubbing the canvas.
And did you notice any like textural differences depending on, rope versus Q-tip versus rag?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, everything you use and apply to paint, and I'm sure that all the artists will concede this also. Any different brush, any different tool you use to apply paint, you get a different effect. And not always the same effect, not always a desired effect, but you do get different effects with the tools. And depending on how abrasive the material is, you see a difference in what you're hoping to achieve. So if you look at this piece specifically and look at where you see a tree line to the right, some of the trees have been applied to a much wetter surface, some a drier surface, some are scrubbed out, reapplied, some are washed in the shadows. I use different materials to scrub them out and to re-wet them.
Oh, that's so cool. I love that. So when I was arranging or choosing the pictures of your work that I wanted to include, I realized I kind of went in going from very brightly and opaquely colored to more monotone, but I just love this piece. This is one of my favorites, kind of the combination of these beautiful golden ochres and yellows to the very pale gray.
Well, thank you. This originally, when I sketched it, was going to be a duotone. I was going to paint it in 2 colors. And I had the preliminary sketch that was in duotone, and I just wasn't getting the background to foreground contrast that I wanted in 2 color. So this is actually 4 colors, but it's very muted. It's all been applied and all the layers have been wiped out at one point. I'm painting this in sections, and you can see the different contour lines where I'm painting them in sections. So I'm not doing an overall wash on something like this. I'm sectioning it off and scrubbing out and wiping out and reapplying washes to certain areas as you get from background to foreground. So you can mute them with
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's once again, one of the things that I've been trying to do with canvas is some different applications than from what you get applying watercolor to paper. You can scrub out a lot and change a lot of the densities of the colors on canvas much more easily than you can on paper.
Oh gosh, I imagine.
Yeah.
I feel like once watercolor is on paper, that's where watercolor is.
Well, yeah, and that's true for a lot of it. But you'll surprise yourself if you try it that you can really, really, really get down to the base paper and change it more than you think you could.
I love that.
As long as you don't let it dry. Yes, as long as it's still wet.
That's good to know. I think Aaron will appreciate that too.
Yeah.
Do these feel appreciably different working from, this previous one, which is so like opaque and lush and thick, to something a little bit more subtle like this one? Like, do they have different feels to them when you're creating them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think any artist will tell you that a lot of it is mood dictated. Depending on, I paint a lot outside. I try to paint outside when I can, even living in an Iowa environment. I can remember when I was working on the larger piece, the previous piece, it was a bright sunny day, no sun, a lot of color. My wife's flower gardens are in full bloom, and I'm looking and I'm seeing color, 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 color. The second piece that's much more muted, I painted that in the middle of the night, and I was feeling like it was the middle of the night and it was quiet and I felt subdued, and I started it and I tried to get the same mood again to finish it. And I was lucky enough to get kind of in the same mood. So it was painted in an entirely different mental position, I would say. And
It
what
definitely feels like
inspired-
that.
Yeah,
That's
it really was. And I
Mhm.
don't want to get too philosophical, but I think painters will agree with me that some days you can paint this and some days you can paint that, depending on your
Mhm.
mood.
That's lovely. I mean, that's certainly the feeling I got from it. So it's really fascinating to know that that's where they came from initially, too.
Right.
Very different mood spaces. And now I am dying to hear about this one, which I think it's so hard to pick a favorite of pieces, but this is definitely one of my favorite pieces of yours. And our education director, she loves this one as well.
Well, thank you. Um, Basically, this came from my history of photography. And I used to take many, many, many Kodachrome slide pictures, and I had a slide developer, and I used to turn them into halftones or monotones. And I realized that many of the pictures that I took with 4-color Kodachrome looked far more interesting in monotone form.
Mm.
And so I sketched this out and I thought, there's no reason why I can't make a monotone out of this piece and see what happens. And so I've actually created this piece a couple times in regular color and in monotone.
Mm.
And it's my version of watercolor noir. How about that?
I love it.
It's let your imagination consider, I could say, well, I was feeling depressed because of the derecho. I felt glib, but that's not really the case. I did it basically because I wanted to see what would happen if I turned my mind's eye into a monotone. And that's what I came up with.
Oh, I love that. That's really
It's
cool.
in one color. It's all lamp black.
Wow. Mm. Yeah, it's just subtle and lovely and almost abstract if you didn't quite know what it was.
Right. I've done many monotones and duotones, Kate. This is an example I'm glad you like. I have many. And this is probably one of my favorites just because I did it in a vertical format too, as
Mhm.
opposed to your traditional landscape horizontal format. I know Mike is sitting there, and Mike many times, excuse me, works in a vertical format on his landscapes. And I've always enjoyed that because traditional landscape artists, of course, want to lay their work down in a horizontal landscape format. So I like the vertical format of this, and I know Mike has appreciated that format also in his paintings. So I'll give homage to Mike, and I'll give homage to my old camera for making me see things in monotone form.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the photography angle.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Mike.
I see a real Zen-like quality to these pieces.
Mhm.
Very meditative. Was that your aim, or is that a byproduct of your process?
Well, Zen and meditative, a lot of times, I'm sure you can attest to this too. A lot of times the simple act of painting is meditative and Zen-ish, if there's such a word. So you might have hit a good nail on the head. I really wanted them to be contemplative, all of them. I had a conversation, not to drop names, but I had a conversation years ago with Stan Wiederspan, and we were talking about what do we possibly do when we have mental creative block. And we were talking about how wonderful it is to watch children paint and draw and create where their minds are free and they don't have any constraint or inhibitions. And in some ways, these are almost my representation of a childish vision of a landscape, simplistic, but contemplative, to use that term again.
Mhm.
So I think you're right, Mike. I think in either knowing it or otherwise, maybe I was thinking about that is, the process of, I hate to use the word.
You mentioned simplistic. I
Yeah,
look at these things and they're far from simple.
Mhm.
There's nothing simplistic about this. I just am struck by them in kind of a contemplative manner, like you mentioned. Yeah, well, it's a beautiful land, and that's what we see, and that I think you captured it.
well, thank you, Mike. I hope that when people look at them, they can imagine standing and looking out a window at seeing landscape that exists and maybe seeing it in a little different way than they've seen it in the past.
Mm-hmm. Very much. Yeah, I would agree. They're zen, but they're also very considered. I feel like you've decided and put your hand to every mark that's on these paintings.
Thank you.
Do we have other questions for Al?
I have one. Do you ever just wing it? Like, instead of planning something out, do you ever just go, I'm just gonna wing it and paint this? Just curious.
Absolutely. I used to entertain myself, excuse me, I used to do things like, I'm going to paint something in a half an hour. And I would. Today,
cool.
I'm going to paint something, I'm right-handed. Today, I'm going to paint something left-handed. Today, I'm going to use brushes I don't ordinarily use. I use Corning plates as palettes. I mean, that's where I keep that's why I have 30 of them with colors all over them. And some days I just basically say eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and pick a palette and give myself X amount of time and X shape and just wing it. So yes, I do that. And it's a great exercise in realizing that, boy, I should probably put more thought into this, or, hey, that was fun. Let's try that again. And now with a 2-year-old granddaughter who loves to draw and paint already, I find that's really, really rewarding for me, is to just wing it, as you said. Very, very fun.
That's so lovely. Wasn't it Picasso who said something like every child is an artist and the difficult part is remaining an artist when one grows up?
I think that's right, Kate.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's right, by all means.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for the unself-conscious way that children create things.
Well, the lack of inhibition,
Mm-hmm.
the lack of expectations in the final product.
Mm-hmm. And just the joy in the process and creating something.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
How do you like silence like your inner critic? Like when you're doing that, that's really hard to do. So how do you like shut your brain off and tell it to be quiet? And
well, I don't really listen to myself. If I did, I probably wouldn't paint. You've got to be able to shut that off. Many times I listen to music for a while and I get inspired. Many times I pick up art magazine, I get inspired. Many times I go to a website and get inspired. Back again to having met many people in my life that have influenced me. Many times I go back and reconsider our conversations. And so if I get to a point in a painting where I'm starting to criticize internally what I'm producing, I might put it away. I might quit. I might try it again, but I just never give up. I never give up on an idea. If I've gotten to the point where I'm going to put paint on paper, and I'm not just doing one of my 30-second or 30-minute exercises or painting left-handed, I'm going to complete that piece one way or another. It may take a different mindset than I have at that time. I may have to go take a hike, but I will complete that piece.
very cool. Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
Plus, I don't care. I don't care to burden myself with self-critique a whole lot.
Mm.
It is what it is. it's in the eye of the beholder. If you like it, you like it. If you don't, you don't. I've never been a huge self-promoter. Criticism doesn't affect me a lot. I paint because I get sheer enjoyment out of it.
Mhm.
It's entertaining in a lot of regards, and it has allowed me to speak and talk to a lot of very, very interesting people over the past 40 years that I probably never would have gotten a chance to meet or know and speak with. So I'm very fortunate in that regard.
Oh, that's so lovely.
Yeah, Al,
Other
I have a question for you. I know you work from sketches. Do you do your sketches on plein air? Do you take out some watercolors and do your sketches, or are they pencil sketches that you then bring back to the studio and then create your piece in the studio?
Sean, I've got little moleskin watercolor journals that I take outside, and basically I do take a small set of watercolors and a pencil and sketch them. And a lot of times they're just a 15, 20-minute study. And at that point, basically, I'm just looking for pure composition and maybe a little bit of color concentration consideration. And then I take those back to my studio and pencil draw them on canvas. And then if I can, I try to paint them outside after I've drawn them. So if I can get to the same location and try to match up, that's what I try to do. But I have books and books, as most artists do, of on the spot sketches and paintings. So a lot of them are in color preliminaries.
Thank you.
Other
I have a follow-up question then. When you
Sure.
travel, like you're going on a trip, do you take a little portable group, a set of watercolors with you so that you can just capture different landscapes, different locations, that's
Absolutely. Yep. In fact, I have a little, I got it from Harbor Freight. It's an ammo box. You've seen those plastic ammo boxes? Well, I don't have any ammo, so I thought I'd use it for watercolor stuff. So inside that little box, I can put a little tray, I can put a water container, I can put 7 or 8 brushes, a couple watercolor journals, and a regular journal and a pen. And so I carry that with me when I travel. A lot of times, even if it's just for a few hours, like say to a state park or something like that, I always take that with me.
I remember seeing that when I was at your studio. It's really cool.
I have a lot of those, Kate.
Other questions?
Do you ever use like gouache, or do you use just traditional watercolors?
Well, I had someone ask me at the opening of the exhibit if these were really watercolors.
Mm-hmm.
They said these looked, I mean, first of all, you're painting on canvas. That's kind of bizarre. And I said, well, yeah, it is. And they said, well, these look like they could be acrylics or gouache. And I said, well, no, they are all watercolor. They're all Winsor Newton watercolors. I have painted in gouache. I've actually painted in egg tempera before. I like the transparency of watercolor. The gouache, I lose that with the opacity. And so I paint strictly in, I'll use it as an advertisement, Winsor Newton watercolor.
Cool.
And that's it. I have done some illustration work in the past where I've used gouache to do some highlight work and things like that, but not in the purest form.
Mm. Any other questions? Well, this has been so wonderful. And Al, thank you so much for being gracious with our technical difficulties. And thank you to everyone who hung with us. This was absolutely lovely. And I learned so much about Al's work from this. I can't put my laptop down, but I'm clapping with one hand.
Can I add one thing?
Absolutely.
Well, it's not one thing, it's many things, but I am so appreciative of the opportunity that the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art has offered me. I'll tell you a little quick story. when I was a child, I came downtown to the Art Center, and I used to ride the bus downtown on Saturdays. And a guy who was the director of the Art Center at the time, I don't remember his name, I think it was Don. Anyway, he said, "Oh, you're observing the Grant Wood." I said, "Yeah, I like Grant Wood. I'm from Cedar Rapids." He said, "Do you like art?" I said, "Well, of course I do. I like to draw and paint." He said, "Well, maybe someday you'll be at the Cedar Rapids Museum of Art."
Oh,
And I thought, whoa. And so here I am sitting here talking to you guys. And I'm so appreciative of you, Kate, and you, Sean, and everybody at the Museum of Art, and to all my friends that I've met over the years that have helped me get to this point. It's kind of a dream come true for me. And so the exhibit is beautiful. I can't thank you enough. I can't thank you enough, and I'm so appreciative.
we are just so lucky to be able to work with amazing local artists like you guys.
Thanks.
It's totally our privilege. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a lovely and safe rest of your Halloween, and thank you so much for joining us. Thanks again, Al.
Thank you, everybody.